Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our session on modeling the future of AI with Jaime Sevilla. We're lucky to have him. He brings unique insights to this field. He posed his PhD in AI and statistics to join Open Philanthropy, focusing on macroeconomics models of AI and automation. During that time, he worked on machine learning trends with the team that would later become EPOC, and he's now the director of EPOC. In this session, Jaime will address the significant implication of advances in AI and automation with a nod to the influential work of Nobel laureate William Nordhaus on climate change. He'll explore three fundamental components of AI advancements: training compute, training data, and algorithms. As Jaime speaks, if questions arise, don't hesitate to add them to swap card, and we'll later take them during the Q&A portion of this session. There will also be an office hour afterwards. So let's now delve into this critical exploration of AI future with Jaime Sevilla.
Thank you, thank you. I'm very pleased to be here and really honored that you have chosen to spend your time coming to this talk, where I'm going to be very glad to share with you the latest insights at EPOC and some exciting plans about what's in the future of our organization. So let me try to tell you what you're going to be learning today. If you stick with me for the next hour, you're going to be coming out of this talk with a much more nuanced understanding of the three key factors that feed into AI development. And not only that, but I'm also going to introduce you to how we can explore these trends and project them into the future with models that draw insights from economics and statistics. All right, so before I get started with all of this, a bit of context. Right now, artificial intelligence is a field that's seeing very rapid progress. In the last 2 years, we have seen many drastic advances in image generation, in text generation, and even in very complex scientific problems such as protein folding. And these new capabilities also come associated with new challenges. There was this recent paper from William Nordhaus at GovAI, where he explored how we can use the recent text generation capabilities of GPT systems to try to do mass scanning. So if we want to safely transition this period from having a relatively low amount of automation to a world in which there is a lot of automation, I think it's crucial that we have a very grounded understanding of artificial intelligence and where it is headed. So how is EPOC contributing to this? I see our research as having essentially two different prongs that come together. One of them is doing a bunch of empirical research and data analysis. We have been collecting data systematically about many machine learning systems over the last decade, and we use that data in order to derive insights about what are some of the relevant trends that have been feeding this process of development. But not only are we interested in the trends of the past, but also we're interested in projecting them into the future. And that's the part where we draw on statistics, we draw on macroeconomical models to try to build this picture about how the future will look like. What are the important things that we will need to pay attention to in the coming decades? Having introduced that, let's get started with trends in machine learning. So what I'm going to be talking about is three very important components of development in machine learning, that are the amount of operations that's being used to train the systems, the data that is being used to train the systems, and the algorithmic innovation, the research that is being done to try to improve the efficiency of the algorithms we have now. After that, I'm going to be talking about how these inputs relate to what we actually care about, which is the performance that these systems can achieve, and put all together to give you a more holistic picture of where AI has been headed in the last couple of years or so. So let's get started talking about like what I consider to be the most important input into machine learning developments, or one of the two most important inputs, which is compute. Up until 2010, people were not really paying a lot of attention to the compute that was being put into the systems. It was still growing, but it was not growing because people were making a dedicated effort to increase the amount of compute that was being used to train the systems. But instead, it was growing because computers were just getting cheaper. You will spend like the same amount of money on like a computer, and people were like training their state-of-the-art machine learning models, statistical models, in like their work laptops. But something changed. Around 2010, we realized that if we invested a lot of compute into a certain kind of architectures, they were able to surpass what was the state-of-the-art up until the moment. That was the moment where like deep learning took off, and this trend of like the amount of compute that was being fed into the systems drastically sped up to like this exponential pace in which like every 6 months, the amount of compute that's being invested into the systems, in the frontier is like essentially doubling. So this is very important, but what is all that compute being used for? Well, it's being used to process data. The process of training a machine learning system, as like I'm sure many of you know, essentially involves like taking like a bunch of training data and then within a computer just feeding that to a system, trying to teach it to replicate the patterns that are being seen in that training data. At Epoch, we investigated like what is the rate at which like the usage of training data is increasing, and we also found, as one might expect, an exponential trend here. Every 15 months or so, the amount of data was being used to train machine learning systems that were used for text generation has been doubling. And sure, like this raises a very natural question, right? Which is that, well, this is growing, and it is true that we're producing more text, like all of you post things on the internet, and those are things that can be used to train the machine learning systems. But which of these trends is faster? Like, will there come a point where like we cannot rely on like this same strategy of just extracting data from the internet and using that to train machine learning systems? So my colleagues, especially Pablo Villalobos, led an investigation where like they tried to answer exactly this question. What will be the point where we're gonna run out of data, so to speak? And like what they found is that right now, the amount of text that there is in the internet is around like 100 trillion words, give or take. And the amount of data that's being used to train a state-of-the-art machine learning systems now is more or less like a trillion words. So it seems that there is like still room to grow. You can still like scale the systems up by a factor of 100 in terms of like the training data that they consume, and like the same strategy will roughly work. But that's not gonna work forever. Like eventually, sometime in the next 2 decades, if the current trend continues, then you are not gonna be able to just rely on like scrapping data from the internet to train these systems. I don't believe that this is going to be, we don't currently believe that this is going to be a significant impediment to the development of machine learning systems. In fact, I do believe that research in data efficiency, though it has been an important part of the field, it hasn't been seen with the same level of urgency as like the efficient use of compute. So like in the future, I expect that we will see a lot of innovation in this part, and we will come up with like clever ways of like training these machine learning systems using less data, or maybe simulating data. More to come in some future Epoch research. But okay, so we have talked about like these two very material inputs to training these machine learning systems, which is the data that it is trained on, and it is the compute, the hardware that is being used to process all that training data. But there is a third very important component, which is that, of course, this is a scientific field where like many practitioners and researchers are trying their best to squeeze out that they can out of that data and training compute. And what this has led is to us finding like more efficient architectures for machine learning that mean that right now we are able to reach like much higher levels of performance, which like much lower data and training compute requirements that we will have naively expected if we're using the same techniques that 1 decade ago. There have been like some attempts to study this question. One particular paper that I really like is from my colleagues, Ege Erdil and Tamay Besiroglu, who studied this in the context of computer vision systems. And what they found is, as you can see in the table over there, the requirements in compute and data were lowering over time as time went on. And if we do the calculation, like it seems that for compute requirements, like every 9 months or so, the amount of compute that you needed to reach like a given level of performance, it has like halved. Like right now, if you wanted to get like a result that was comparable to what the state of the art was in 2012, you're going to need like orders of magnitude less compute to reach that performance. We also found like that there's also like some indications that the amount of data decreases, but then again, data hasn't really been a bottleneck. It has not been a priority, and we actually didn't find like a significant trend in there, though it seems to be decreasing too. One very cool thing from the study of my colleagues is that we can use their technique to try to quantify what is the relative importance of like these 3 factors that I have mentioned. Like what is the relative importance of compute, what has been the relative importance of data, and how important has been algorithmic progress to explain the performance of modern machine learning systems, state-of-the-art machine learning systems in the last decade. And what they found is that for the field of like computer vision is that data didn't seem to be that important, in line with what I've been saying of like it hasn't been traditionally a bottleneck. But within compute and algorithms, they seem to be like roughly important, roughly equally important. It's been important that we have access to, developers have access to more compute, but it's also been important that they have been learning how to use that compute more efficiently. All right, so far, what I have been talking about is mostly about inputs to these machine learning systems, to the data input, the training compute input, and the scientific input to the systems. What we really care about, if we want to understand the future of artificial intelligence, is not only the inputs to the systems, but also what will be the outputs, what will be the capabilities that the systems are going to achieve. And good news for us, it turns out that there is like a very prolific scientific area of study, which is the area of scaling laws that has been studying exactly this question about like how we can relate the scale of the systems that we train to the performance that they achieve. And they have found like for concrete domains, for specific domains, somewhat stable mathematical relationships between the performance that this model is reaching and like the size of the model and the data is being used to train, which are 2 things that correlate with like the amount of compute that's being put. If you have a bigger model, you're going to need to spend more compute to train it. If you have more data, you're going to need more compute to process all that data. This of course just tells us something about what could we call upstream performance in the lingo. This just tells you about like what is the numerical performance that these systems achieve in like the training in like the settings that they are being tested on during development. But there is some upcoming investigation, and there is a lot of empirical evidence that actually this upstream performance correlates a lot with what we care about, with this downstream performance, with these capabilities that the system has. These capabilities as diverse as like writing code, writing poetry, coming up with clever anagrams when you give them the prompt to do so. So, what have we learned so far? Let's take a stock. I've been talking about inputs to machine learning and like how they relate to performance. In the previous slide, I've tried to argue that there has been a better understanding in the last few decades of like how with more compute and more data, you're getting more performance. That we're also seeing that like we're getting clever at like using that compute and data. Even though even though I saw like these scaling laws keep being updated. Like shortly after a very a very prominent paper from OpenAI on scaling laws, like 2 years after, there was like another paper from DeepMind where they said like, no, actually you can get like much more performance than was previously thought using again like comparable amounts of compute. So what we have is that what I want you to take away from this is that in order to understand the performance that machine learning systems are getting, three key things you need to be tracking is like the compute that goes into the systems, which like right now seems to be doubling at an exponential pace every 6 months. You have to keep track of the data, which like right now is not a bottleneck. In the future, it might be a bottleneck, but again, I feel we will find a workaround. Around this, but also this might change the way that we approach the development of machine learning systems, and it's doubling right now like every 15 months or so. And lastly, all this scientific input that has gone into the systems, all this tinkering and development is making us more efficient at like training these machine learning systems. Right now, like it seems that the amount of compute that you need to train a machine learning system up to a desired level of performance is like halving every 9 months or so. And like a lot of that experimentation and tinkering goes through like creating experiments, running these systems, and like learning is not just like thinking, but there seems to be an improvement in the way that we are approaching machine learning. So, all right. So far, I've talked a lot about like trends in the past, and I've talked a lot about like the relationship between like inputs to machine learning systems and their performance. And these seem to be like some really exciting building blocks that we can build on top of. Like, wouldn't it be nice if we were able to like model like how these trends might extrapolate into the future, and from there like try to get some insights about the performance? Well, I'm gonna try to give you a quick tour about like what is the state of the art of that modeling right now. I try to give you like a very brief idea of like how this is done, and then like tease you what's coming after. What are we working on at Epoch to try to push the state of the art in modeling the future of AI, and most importantly, how this might be useful in order to inform policy making in the coming years. So let's start through a very simplistic compute-centric model of AI, which I think is going to be a useful exercise for you to gain an understanding of, like, in practice, what do these models look like. So in order to have like a model about the future of AI, you need the first ingredient that you need is a way of relating the inputs of the system to like levels of capability. I'm going to be focusing here on compute for two reasons. One of them is that this has been traditionally the case in like modeling the future of AI. And second, it has been the case for a good reason. It really seems that compute has been a critical bottleneck for developing new machine learning systems. As I said before, it seems that compute and algorithms were like the two key bottlenecks that were driving the progress of machine learning over the last decade or so. So now, how do we relate a given level of compute to a given level of performance? This is a really hard question. I don't think that right now we have a very sophisticated answer to that, but we have like some indications of like possible estimates and guesses that you can make. Like one very famous one that was done in 2020 was the bioanchors estimate by Ayakotra, where like she came up with a way of like through a comparison with like the human brains, and also through some insights about like how machine learning works and how training works. It came up with like a way of like associating like a given level of compute with like a given level of performance. But not, and we are building on top of this. Like recently at Epoch, we released a report which is called the direct approach, in which we came up with like a new way of making this estimate. All of these things are like very preliminary and like very speculative, but they are like a very necessary components of like these models that we're trying to build. And I'd be really excited about like more people trying to come up with better ways of measuring this, and like with critiques of like what has been done so far. Roughly the output that we're looking for is like, again, like a level of compute, how does it associate with a level of performance? And I've put in there like some rough guesses about like what that might say. Again, don't take this like take this critically, think about this critically, don't take this as the final word, but this roughly corresponds to like some of my central guesses about like how much compute I might get, maybe a bit on the conservative side. Right now it seems that we're training models with around like 3 times 10 to the 25 floating point operations. And it's plausible that if we had like 10 more orders of magnitude of compute, we will be able to train these very sophisticated systems that might be able to like automate everything. Maybe, again, here, once you start extrapolating through multiple orders of magnitude, you should definitely be very skeptical about the results, but grant me this for the time being. All right, so we have now this map of like how compute goes to levels of performance. The second thing that we want to know is like, all right, how long is it gonna take us to go from where we are to like the relevant benchmarks that we're interested in, the relevant thresholds of capability that we think might be associated with important capabilities or with important risks. Well, for that, we're gonna need to take a stock of like the components that go into increasing the stock of compute that we have to train machine learning systems. The first one is investment. As I said before, since 2010, there has been a rising amount of interest in training deep learning models that has cashed out into the state-of-the-art machine learning models being trained year after year on more and more compute. Like our central guess of like how this trend, the magnitude of this trend over the last decade is that every 2 years, the amount of compute that goes into a state-of-the-art machine learning systems, it multiplies by 10, which is a lot. What is this money used for? Well, it is used to buy hardware, and like that hardware is getting more efficient over time. This is related to like some famous laws, like Moore's law in the case of transistors. Now it's a law for like machine learning specific hardware. But we did an investigation at Epoch about like how quickly is hardware improving, and it seems that the current trend is that every 10 years or so, compute gets like an order of magnitude cheaper. So you can get like 10 times more compute. The last thing that we need to take into account is that, well, I told you that we are getting more clever on training these machine learning systems. We need less and less compute for reaching higher and higher performances. And again, this is really hard to measure, and here there's like a huge uncertainty bar. But if we were to take literally what we found in the computer vision case in the last decade, where our central guess is that, well, like roughly it's roughly like every 2 years the amount of compute that you need to train to reach a level of performance, it decreases by 10. Question mark. And these 3 things, if you add them together, they tell you like how the amount of effective compute that you have, like compute adjusted for like this algorithmic improvement, is gonna grow year after year, and it seems like it multiplies by 10 every year if you add these 3 things together. So if you had, with this map in mind, you can have a guess, you can make some guesses about like how long is it gonna take to reach like a certain level of automation and a certain level of full automation. Now, I think that this is an example to give you some insight about like how these models are built in practice. I think that this model is really bad for multiple reasons. One that I already mentioned is that like, well, that arrow on top of there, like we don't really have really solid empirical evidence that that's really how it's going to shake out. There's like more things like, well, these trends like might not be exactly what we care about. Like I talk about algorithmic improvements in the context of computer vision, but really computer vision is not everything that we care about. We care more about like progress in more general areas of like machine learning that can help us automate like a wider variety of jobs, and they're like the trend might look different. And I'm gonna raise like 2 more critiques that I think are like really important. Like one of them is that these inputs don't evolve on their own. They are the product of investment. Like the amount of investment that's being put into the systems, like remember from here, like it seems to be multiplying by 10 every 2 years. Like that's not a sustainable trend. Like after 10 years of that growth, eventually you hit a cap. Like right now, the machine learning systems are being trained on like $10 million of hardware costs, roughly. $10 million, you know, it's a lot, but it's not that much in the context of like of an industry investment. But if you multiply that by a factor of like 1 million, then suddenly you really need like another financing model to try to sustain that. Like a private company will not be able to do that, and like eventually the amount of resources that will be needed to keep building these factories to produce more hardware that you use to train the systems, like it reaches a limit. So that trend is meant to end at some point. This is just an example. Like the other trends, again, like they don't evolve on their own. They are the product of like decisions that like other people are making around it, and like the scientific progress that we make on like hardware progress, on like algorithmic progress, etc. So ideally, we will want a more dynamic way of modeling that. And there's a second reason why we are interested in adding more dynamism to the model, which is that if we want to understand the policy implications of like these kind of models, it's really important to know what are going to be the second-order effects of affecting the system. Going back here again, like imagine right now, like one of the policies that people are considering is restricting the amount of compute that's being used to train machine learning systems. If you were to stop like all this investment that's being used to buy more hardware to train the systems, well, that money does not disappear. Like all that energy is going to go somewhere else. Like presumably, it might go to algorithmic improvements, and that might increase instead. So we will want to know a way of like, all right, if like all that investment is redirected to another area, like what might be achieved then? Like how does the policy affect the second-order decisions that like investors might make in it? They might also, here I describe like a way in which like, you know, they might redirect it in a positive way, but also like another thing that might happen is that if you put this restriction, then suddenly investing in machine learning systems is not as productive anymore. If you have these restrictions, you're expecting to get like less performance, so maybe people will be like less willing to invest in machine learning as a whole. Those are like two competing effects that we will need to model if we wanted to have a sophisticated understanding of like how a policy that restricts the amount of compute that's being used to train the systems will actually affect the trajectories of development that we will see in reality. All right, so I've given you an example of like a compute-centric model about the future of AI, and I've told you like why this model is not good enough and what we need more. Now I'm going to talk a bit about like what might be a promising step forward, a promising solution to try to address some of the issues. And those are integrated assessment models. So integrated assessment models are like models that integrate like a part that is like about the economy, about modeling the economy, and a part that is like field specific. The most famous example of an integrated assessment model are climate change models, like the ones that were developed by William Nordhaus, who received a Nobel Prize in 2018 precisely for this kind of work. And there's some models where like you have a climate model that tells you like how emissions are going to be produced. Those emissions are going to affect production, and like that's going to have like a series of knockdown effects where like, well, if you have less productions, you produce less. You're also going to have to be spending more on like some abatement strategies, and that affects like the amount of emissions that will be made into the future. And this kind of like dynamic loop is really useful if you want to test out like what will be the effects of a policy that, like, for example, taxes the amount of emissions that like an industry is producing. I feel like this has been quite successful in climate change, and I'm really excited about building something analogous for artificial intelligence. What I would want to have is like analogous to the International Panel on Climate Change, where like it's an organization that's iteratively building, collaboratively building on these models about the future of artificial intelligence, which are continuously refined and that help us have like a better map of like what different policies will do, so we can make better decisions together. So, how do we do about that? Let's briefly tour through what has been done up until this point, and I will tell you about like what at Epoch we're doing to try to move the state of the art forward. So I've been talking about integrated assessment models as like having these two components, the economic part and the part that's like field specific. And we have past work on like both of these strands of work that have happened, both in academia but also outside of academia. In the academic part, there is of course a lot of interest in like how growth happens, how macroeconomy, in the field of macroeconomy, economists are really interested in understanding like how scientific innovation progresses, like how investments in like R&D result in like higher productivity in the future. And there's lots of insights in there that we can build from, and like people have been trying to apply them superficially to AI already, and we can build some insights from there. Like, for example, like there's this paper that I highlighted from EAG, Jones, and Jones, where like they try to do something like this, apply the one very well-recognized branch of growth theory, which is semi-endogenous growth theory, to the problem of AI and automation. And I will, this is just an example. There's like many others who have built on that, and of course there's like a very rich literature on like productivity models, like and growth models in economics. On the other part, on the compute-centric modeling, there's also people who have been trying to think about like what are sensible ways of thinking about like what are the key inputs to machine learning systems, and like how those do relate to different levels of capabilities. Of course, I have to mention the draft report from Ayakotra on forecasting transformative AI with biological anchors, which has been a huge part of like all work that has come after. And now we need to put these two parts together, the part that deals with economy and the part that deals with like the AI and automation specifically. And there has already been like one first attempt at a synthesis. Tom Davidson from Open Philanthropy wrote this draft report on what a compute-centric framework says about AI takeoff speeds, where like he combined insights from the bioanchors report with like classical semi-endogenous growth theory to build this first stage integrated assessment model. And I think we should build on, that's a model that we helped develop at Epoch, and I think we should keep building on top of that. I'm really excited about Epoch taking the leadership of creating the next generation of these models, integrating like the latest research and thinking that has happened, and also like critiques that other people may have after engaging with like the current iteration of the models. And why do we care about that? Again, because I think that this might be important for policy. Like it seems that right now the state of discourse in policies, like people are having some good ideas of like what would be policies that might be interesting to implement, but it's really hard to understand how these policies might backfire. I don't think that these models are like the whole solution to that. Like obviously these models are built on like different assumptions, and they're not an oracle that we can completely rely on, but they force us to be specific, they force us to be concrete, and they force us to be coherent, which I think can be very informative for like people who are thinking about like how to design policy and which policies to push forward. So what comes next? At Epoch, we're building GATE, the Growth and AI Transformation Endogenous Model, which builds on top of like the semi-endogenous growth model that Tom Davidson developed, but adds some features that we believe are really important if we want to use that to inform policy. Probably the most important change that we're making is that investment decisions, instead of being hard-coded rules, they are dynamic things that change depending on the expectation of like the simulated investors in the model, and which helps you model like, all right, when you change one of the conditions of the model, if you impose like, for example, like a limit on the amount of compute that companies can invest, like how does that affect the investment decisions that people make? Will they invest more in other areas? Will like overall investment reduce, etc. The second reason why, the second contribution is that this is incorporating like new research. Like for example, one thing that we are keen on modeling better is like how when you up the investment in an area, like well, investment is not magic. Like it doesn't mean if you up the investment by like a quantity of 10, it doesn't mean that like research output is gonna go up by 10. Like this is already like incorporated in a way in Davidson's model, but I feel like there is some insights from like traditional economics that we can incorporate and that affect the conclusions that we might see. And a third thing that I'm really excited about is that this model simplifies a lot. The Davidson model has like a lot of parameters, has like over 50 parameters, if I understand correctly. The model that we're building, it has like less than 20. The fact that it's like a simpler model, it can give us more confidence in that each of the parameters of the model is like well informed by research, and also give us more confidence in like the whole picture. It's something that's easier to validate. It's something that is easier to present to economists who might be able to engage with it and point out like what are the flaws of the system. So this is what we're gonna build, and what are we gonna be using it for? Well, we're gonna be using it to hopefully inform policy, and I'm gonna tease to you a result to try to give you the flavor of like what are the kind of results that might come out of this modeling. This is a very preliminary result. We haven't vetted it, so you probably shouldn't trust a lot the numbers. I think that the basic insight will remain stable through iterations of the model, though this might be misleading in important ways that we might only realize later. So please put your critical thinking caps on. But having said that, one of the things that we were interested in is, I mentioned that many people right now are thinking about like trying to lobby for like restrictions on the amount of compute that's being used to train the systems. And like one way that you can incorporate that is as a moving bright line, a moving threshold on the amount of physical compute that you can invest into these machine learning systems. So we were trying to think about like, all right, like how does that affect like the trajectories of growth that we might see? And we are interested in this question because the different trajectories of growth that we have can have like drastically different consequences about like how drastic future risks might be and what's the profile of risk that we expect. So for example, if we see a very rapid development, then maybe that's going to be a very rapid period of change that might be like really unstable and very difficult to govern. Whereas if we see like a smoother path to full automation, then like we might be able to like iteratively build like better governance, better technical solutions for managing AI. And roughly what we found is that if you think that like AI risk is something like relatively easy to solve, we can make a lot of progress in the next few years, then like you should be more bullish on like trying to stop development in AI while we figure that out. And once that is figured out, then like sure, we can just like go ahead and lift those restrictions so we can reap all the rewards that will come out of AI. But if you believe that the problem is really hard, then you have a really difficult, you have a harder trade-off to make, because presumably, because if you impose restrictions and those restrictions are not like completely fail-proof, then in the future you might end up in a situation where like there's like a large gap between like what industries or agents interested in developing AI systems can train and like what is the level of deployment that we have seen so far. And if one of them decides to like not follow the regulation and just like train as big of a model as they can, suddenly we might see like orders of magnitude discontinuity on like the on the inputs that go into the system, which like as I said before from the slide on Scalinos laws, might be associated with like a drastic discontinuity on the capabilities of the model that we might not be ready to manage just yet. So again, this is just an example. I wanted to over-index from it, but what I would want you to take away is that we can use these models to inform policy. And let's just wrap everything together so you can come home with a conclusion. This is what I would want you to remember from this talk. First of all, there's 3 key inputs to AI development: the amount of compute that's being used to train the systems, the amount of data that the systems is being trained on, and like the amount of the algorithmic innovations that are happening to use that data and that compute more efficiently. The second one is that inputs seem to be relating predictably to performance so far. This is by no means like a mathematical proof or like a guarantee, but it seems like reality so far has played nicely in that way. And by our default case, I believe, should be also to expect that relationship to continue in the future, in the model case. What I've been trying to argue for is that we need to step up our level of discussion on like the future of artificial intelligence. And I propose like one concrete way forward that like Epoch is gonna be pushing, and that I'm excited about other people also contributing to that and like engaging with it and like using it, which is integrated assessment models, similar to what was done for climate change back in the 70s, 80s. And lastly, I hope that I have convinced you that this integrated assessment modeling exercise is not only a scientifically exciting adventure, but it also has very real consequences. We are hoping that we're going to be able to model consequences of like the policies that right now are being pushed forward and try to understand better like what consequences they will have. And that was everything that I wanted to talk about. So thank you so much for sticking with me in this presentation.
Thank you so much, Jaime. That was so insightful. So we're going to move towards the question and answer section of our chat. And so if you have questions, don't hesitate to add them to swap card and upvote the ones you're most interested in hearing the answers. So we already have lots of questions. Yes, let's start with the first one. It's a question by Lucy, asking, do you have a model for the inputs to algorithmic progress? You mentioned talent, but would you also expect it to respond to the price of compute as well? In particular, she explains, if compute gets more expensive, there might be more incentive to make progress on algorithms.
This is an excellent question, and this is something that I'd be keen on investigating more within Epoch and other people also contributing to it. My Roth model about like how these kind of advancements are happening is like there is a part of that which are theoretical insights, like people thinking harder about like what are the kind of loss functions that can be made, what kind of like architectures I'm promising to try. But then there is like a very important tinkering component, and like that tinkering component, of course, builds a lot on like the compute capacity that we have up until now. Like I think that a lot of the rapid progress that we have seen in algorithms is due to a lot of people having access to like really cheap compute that they can use to rapidly try out their ideas and have this feedback loop where they can quickly see if they work. I noticed that I don't yet have like a super good understanding, like a super formal understanding of like how exactly these inputs relate to each other, like how important they are with respect to one another. But I will be really excited about building this in the future and understanding it better.
Nice. There is also another question regarding compute. So you mentioned compute is currently doubling every 6 months. Do you have a sense on how long that will be sustainable, given that chips are reaching the physical limits for density of transistor, and given the current supply chain constraints for GPUs?
Right. So right now, the amount of compute that's being fed into the systems essentially is a combination of like the amount of investment that goes into the systems, and the price performance that you can get out of that investment. And that it's a really difficult question to model exactly this price performance. Let me focus first on the investment, because the investment, we can have a better idea of like where it is headed, right? Like investment, there is no way that can be held by like more than a decade right now. Like the current pace at which like this growth is happening, like we will need to see like a really drastic expansion of the economy in order to accommodate that level of growth for like more than a decade. Now, what is the price performance that we might be able to get? I feel like I will want to have like a better understanding of it. It seems like, well, there is still some room for like improving the hardware that we have, but It's a difficult question. Like, I think that one part of the difficulty is that the price performance that you can get, it seems to decrease as like you invest more and more. Like one of the biggest bottlenecks right now in hardware is like the connectivity between like the different GPUs that you're training your machine on. And like there comes a point where like, you cannot expect to just like buy 10 times more GPUs and expect to get like 10 times more performance out of it. And then in terms of like, will the price performance of like an individual GPU change over time? And it's like, well, sure, I think it's going to improve, but how long is that going to be sustained for? The trend has been sustained for a while, so the naive way is just expect that to continue, but again, there is like some fundamental limits that will need to be solved, some hardware challenges that we'll need to address. And I feel like right now, I don't really have like a really good understanding of like what those limits might be.
So you mentioned that you were tracking sort of like the level of automation. You have like 20%, 100% automation. But there is a question regarding sort of like what level is enough to have AGI. So what do we do if one explanation 28 flop is enough for full automation, which is like AGI?
Yeah, more research needed. Like, I guess that there is two parts of this question. I'm going to focus on the part on like what level of automation is needed for like radical transformation. Like here, I don't know, like it probably feels like the most transformative thing that we could get to automate is like the science making progress. Like science has, economists all agree that technology has been the key reason why we have seen growth in the economy over the last few centuries. So once we are able to remove the labor input, to substitute the labor input to science, or at least like drastically improve the productivity of like people who are involved in R&D, then that might have like very drastic consequences on like what levels of growth we might see in the future, like what levels of like technological craziness we might see in the future. But I really don't have a super nuanced understanding of like what are the key tasks that you will need to automate within science to make that happen. And that's something that we're going to be trying to tease out at Epoch. No promises made, because I think this is one of the hardest challenges that we have ahead of us, trying to understand what are the key tasks and like how hard it will be to automate.
Right, that seems like a great open avenue for our research. Sounds great. We have another question regarding how much we should trust these integrated assessment models. So to what degree, Simon asks, to what degree have integrated assessment models been validated before? Intuitively, he says, I'm very skeptical of anything that tries to model society, which seems really chaotic to me.
I think that skepticism is warranted, and like I would caution about people like directly interpreting these models as like the ground truth. The reason why I think that these models are really important is because right now it seems that the state of discussion about like the future of artificial intelligence is based a lot on like loose analogies, and it's like somewhat unmarred from like what is actually happening in like the field of machine learning. I think that these kind of exercises will force us to tell stories about the future of artificial intelligence, which are like, one, grounded in what's happening right now, and two, that they are coherent. The fact that we're writing down this as like mathematical equations, and it forces us to not have like internal inconsistencies in the stories that we're saying. Now, then again, like these are gonna be stories, and like they are not. We shouldn't be just like blindly trusting them. I think that this can be a useful input for like governance researchers and forecasters to try to inform their thinking about like how plausible these stories about like rapid automation and growth might be, but not the end product. And one thing that I will add on top of that is about the difficulty of testing these models. Like right now, we don't yet have like widespread like automation due to AI, and that is the part where like this model is separate from like traditional macroeconomic models. If you look at traditional macroeconomic models up until this point, they're going to make the same predictions that these integrated assessment models, because we haven't yet reached the point where like, this 20% automation of the economy, or however you want to think about that. That is the point where like this model will start making like predictions that could be in principle falsified. So yeah, take it with a skepticism, but I think it's really useful exercise to force us to be coherent, force us to be critical about the stories that we're telling about the future of AI.
Also seems like in climate, these assessments have been very useful. So another question we have is from Vincent. How do you think your work might help and inform safety and alignment versus advancing capabilities similarly to how scaling laws probably did?
Well, we're not doing like any direct research with like machine learning models, except in some very specific situations. Like I think that most of what we're doing is just collecting the information that is out there, rather than like giving you recipes about like how you might combine data and compute to get new capabilities. I think that for the most part, this is going to be robustly good. I think that people having a shared, better understanding of AI is going to help us coordinate with one another, make sure that we make good decisions about the field. Maybe there are like some weird 3D chess moves of like, oh, the work that Epoch is doing, it might raise some salience about like the stable relationship between like compute and capabilities, and maybe that makes like a big lab more bullish on their strategy. I tend to be cautious of like this kind of like 3D chess reasoning, but it's something that we take seriously internally at Epoch, and we definitely have discussions about like, all right, like what could be the effects of our work. For the time being, I'm pretty excited about what we're doing being open for criticism and for people to build on top of. But yeah.
Makes sense. Yes, actually we have a follow-up question. If you have any insights on that regarding the climate risk and the integrated assessment models, how much did the integrated assessment models developed in the 70s, 80s help mitigate climate risk? If they were not very successful at reducing climate risk, will it work for AI risk by Juan?
I have to admit that I have a bit of homework pending on like studying like how successful integrated assessment models were for climate change. They were definitely very influential. Like policy discussions has been like drastically shaped by the integrated assessment models and the work of like Nordhaus and also the International Panel on Climate Change. I don't want to step out of my expertise and invite people to maybe read more about them later. But so far, what I've learned seems to be optimistic.
Right, yes, indeed. Does Epoch have any sense of whether we will reach a data or compute bottleneck first, and whether or not that bottleneck comes before or after AGI?
Well, I mean, in a sense, we're already bottlenecked by compute. I think that if right now companies were investing like 10 times more compute, then that will lead them to making advances in capabilities. I think that data is not being a bottleneck in the sense that I talked about before. You could presumably scale the amount of data that's being used by the models by a factor of 100, and you will not run out of the data that's already available out there on the internet. Yeah, I think we're running out of time, but I'd be pleased to talk more about this in the office hours.
Yes. So this conversation doesn't need to end. There will be office hour right after this in East Mall 5. So you're welcome to join then. And let's thank again Jaime for his great talk.
Thank you, Caroline.